Starting in 1949, a man dressed in black with a white scarf, wide-brimmed hat and cane would sneak into Westminster Graveyard in Baltimore. There, he would approach Edgar Allan Poe's grave, where he would raise a toast to the author and then place a half-empty bottle of Martell cognac and 3 red roses on the grave. This happened every year on January 19th, Poe's birthday. Now known as the Poe Toaster, he continued this ritual until 1998, when he died and passed on the tradition to his sons. They finally ended the tradition after 2009, the 200th anniversary of Poe's birth. At least that is the official story. However, in 2007, a 92-year-old man named Sam Porpora came forward and claimed to have been the Poe Toaster. Porpora used to work as church historian for the Westminster Church, where Poe is buried, which helped the legitimacy of his claim. He said that he invented it in the 1970s with his tour guides as a publicity stunt to get some money for the church, which at the time was apparently overgrown and a favorite spot for drunken derelicts. However, ever since this story broke in 2007, the common belief is that Porpora's story is false. This is mostly due to a man named Jeff Jerome. Jerome was the curator for Poe's old house that was turned into a museum, but more importantly, he claims to have observed the ceremony every year since 1977. If you see a source talking about the Poe Toaster, odds are they reference or directly mention Jeff Jerome. Here he is on Wikipedia, the New York Times, the Smithsonian, the Guardian, Wall Street Journal, etc. Jerome dug up an old 1950 newspaper clipping from the Baltimore Evening Sun about an anonymous visitor leaving a bottle annually on Poe's grave. This, as well as a few other inconsistencies in Porpora's story, like him telling the media an incorrect year that an interview happened, was sufficient in the eyes of the media and the public to disprove his claims. However, I am here to say that Porpora's main claim, that the modern Poe Toaster was mostly a manufactured story by the people who worked at the church during the 1970s, is almost definitely true. So, the first thing to investigate is this 1950 newspaper clipping that Jeff Jerome claims is the earliest documentation of the Poe Toaster. It was part of this interview with a reverend of the church, a guy named Bruce MacDonald. Apparently, it was the centennial of the church's founding, and coincidentally, the centennial +1 of Edgar Allan Poe's death. So, the clipping goes like this. The anonymous citizen who creeps in annually to place an empty bottle of excellent label against the tomb of Poe on the anniversary of his death is a jokester, Mr. MacDonald figures. That is it. There is no reference to this anonymous citizen anywhere else in the article, nor in any other of MacDonald's interviews. There are quite a few problems with this excerpt. First, the bottle is described as empty, when in recent years it is half empty. But the more important issue in this is that it says that the bottle is placed on the anniversary of his death, not his birth, as it is in more recent years. This piece of information is conveniently left out of the clipping when Jeff Jerome describes it to reporters 60 years later. Along with those direct contradictions, MacDonald also doesn't mention what kind of liquor the empty bottle of excellent label is. Why would he not mention that it is always cognac? It makes a much more compelling story. There's also no mention of roses left along with the cognac, which is half of the tradition. After this tiny excerpt, it is a long time until the next mention of the Poe Toaster in writing. 26 years later, in 1976, our very own Sam Porpora was interviewed in The Sun magazine, which was a magazine run by the Baltimore Sun that was discontinued in 1996. Again, it is a very brief mention. One of the most amusing of Mr. Porpora's stories concerned the anonymous visitor who used to visit the cemetery on the anniversary of Poe's birth and prop an empty bottle of expensive Scotch whiskey up against the tomb. Okay, if you've been paying attention, the issues here should be evident. Although the story has now changed to be on the anniversary of Poe's birth, not death, Porpora directly contradicted the prevailing story of the Poe Toaster, which is that he places a bottle of cognac against the tomb. Here, Porpora claims that it is expensive Scotch whiskey. You might say that this is just a misspeak or the journalist wrote down the wrong thing, but a year later, in a different interview, Porpora again claims that it is Scotch whiskey, not cognac, that is placed against the grave. The other, maybe more important issue here, is that he says used to when referring to the tradition, as in discontinued, former. Coincidentally, 1976 was also the same year that something else happened.
My name is Jeff Jerome.
Yes.
I'm the former curator of the Poe House here in Baltimore, but I've been associated with the Westminster Graveyard since 1976.
Jeez.
The following year, 1977, was the first documentation of anything resembling the official story. This was also the first of what I would call contemporary reporting. Instead of months later, or potentially decades later, this story was published the very next day. That being said, there are still some pieces of information that diverge from the modern tradition. First of all, it says the Kuiper Cherry Brandy instead of the Martell Cognac that is usual. Well, except there is no usual yet, because this is the first time any specific incident has been reported on. This is also the first time that it is said that flowers are left for the bottle, except apparently they were left later than the brandy, and also not specifically red roses, nor specifically 3 of them, which again is not a contradiction, but surely if 3 red roses are left every year, that would be a much better story to tell a reporter. Also, that bottle is clearly not half empty. While researching, I made no real attempt to ascertain the identity of the Poe toaster, but in this clipping, there's a big clue that I've seen no one else mention in all of my research. There was a note left along with the bottle that stated, "Edgar, I haven't forgotten you," on it. This part is well documented, it's even on Wikipedia, but the second part that has seemingly been lost to history is that it is signed W. If you thought that the note was legitimate, what is likely one of the initials of the Poe toaster is one of the biggest hints toward his identity ever. The next year there were no articles, but the year after that, 1979, the AP interviewed Jeff Jerome in April about the Poe toaster. This year, apparently, a bottle of Amontillado was placed. Amontillado is a kind of sherry, which is a kind of fortified wine, which is a wine that has harder liquor added to it. More relevant is that Edgar Allan Poe wrote a short story called The Cask of Amontillado, which Jeff Jerome mentions in the interview. This is just another example of the historical record not matching the modern portrayal of the ritual. The following year, Jeff Jerome does another interview in which he briefly mentions the Poe toaster. Every January 19th, the date of Poe's birth in 1809, a bottle of brandy is placed at the monument commemorating his final resting place, according to Jeff Jerome. The year succeeding the year in which he is quoted as saying Amontillado, he says, "Actually, it has always been brandy." The next year, 1881, is the first year that actually mirrors the modern sobriquet. There are 3 red roses, there's cognac, it's even Martell branded. However, it also straight up says that the roses are new. The next year, it was changed to say that the roses were always left with the liquor, ever since 1949. The issue that we're running into here is that most of these articles are research using only one source, the interview of Jeff Jerome that day. The journalists don't even check on the article from the previous year, even if it is from their own newspaper. Therefore, none of these inconsistencies are found by the newspapers. In fact, as far as I'm aware, none of these inconsistencies have been found anywhere by anybody. I am the first person to notice any of this stuff. I am under no illusion that the Poe toaster is some cultural touchstone, but still, hundreds of newspaper articles have been written on it. It has its own Wikipedia page, multiple YouTube videos with over 100,000 views. Much of the informative content on the internet does not have that much in-depth research put into it. A lot of the time it's just the Wikipedia article on the topic, a few recent news articles, and other online content that is probably using the exact same sources as it. If you ever try to find the primary sources of these kinds of things, especially if they are historical events, you often see that if you follow the citations, they eventually end in trusting the word of some guy, in this case, Jeff Jerome. Unless someone actually goes back to check the original documents, the truth can be shaped through one man's words. The next year, the Poe toaster was officially named the Poe toaster, albeit hyphenated. Around this time, Jeff Jerome begins inviting people to observe the visitations, presumably to increase the publicity around the event. Oh, and not only has it always been cognac, it has always been the same brand of Martell cognac, which is interesting. There's also the fact that until 1985, Jeff Jerome never actually saw the Poe toaster, often for cartoonish reasons. In 1978, apparently he rushed out to use the bathroom, and then when he got back, the items were there. And then in 1982, he left to get a hamburger, and when he returned, the items were there. The ritual carries on like this until 1987, when the observers, including Jeff Jerome, begin saying that the person who shows up looks different than they used to. It appears to be a different person. This guy was big. Going by the official story, this shouldn't be the case. If you remember, the story commonly told is that it is the same guy all the way up until 1999, when he died and passed the tradition off onto his sons. However, before 1999, there were at least 5 years where it was a different person. 87, 88, 89, 92, and 98 were described by observers, including Jeff Jerome, as looking distinctly different. You might ask, if Jeff Jerome knew the story was artificial, why would he mention the people look different? The answer is that he's not the only one there. There are multiple other people observing the ritual, and if they remark on something different about the Poe toaster's appearance, it would look more suspicious for Jeff not to mention it. Then, as I said, in 1999, a note was left saying that the original Poe toaster had died, and that the tradition would continue. It said the new visitor was related to the old Poe toaster, and also said that there was more information on the note that Jeff Jerome would not share with the public. After the changeover, the new Poe toaster left 2 notes that were poorly received. The first, in 2001, where he forecasted the New York Giants to win against the Baltimore Ravens at the Super Bowl, which, by the way, did not happen. The second was in 2004, where he insults the French, saying that Poe's grave is no place for French cognac, presumably because of France's opposition to the Iraq War. This has all been catalogued extensively. The rituals continued until 2009, when they suddenly stopped. No goodbye note, it was an Irish exit. Most people, including me, think that it stopped in 2009 because that was the bicentennial of Poe's birth. Given that I have just shown evidence that the commonly told story of the Poe toaster is false, I think I should present what I think is the most likely alternative, given all the evidence. Here's what I am guessing happened. Soon after Jeff Jerome got a job at Westminster Cemetery in 1976, He was looking through old newspaper articles about the cemetery and found that interview with Reverend Bruce A. McDonald back in 1950. He finds the short section about an anonymous visitor leaving a bottle of liquor on Poe's grave, and his curiosity is piqued. He goes to someone more senior at the church, possibly Sam Porpora or a man named Alexander Rose. One of them tells Jeff, yeah, some guy used to drop off an empty bottle of scotch on Poe's birthday. This reminds Sam Porpora of the mystery, so when he is interviewed that same year, he mentioned the story of a man who used to drop off expensive Scotch whiskey at Poe's grave. When the next January 19th comes around, one of them suggests reviving the tradition for publicity, under a more compelling narrative. Instead of whiskey, fancy cherry brandy, with a cryptic note, Edgar, I haven't forgotten you, signed by the mysterious W. Now, why would they fabricate a story like this when they are supposed to be just esteemed Poe experts and historians? Well, the answer is publicity, as you might think, but it is probably publicity for a good reason. Jeff Jerome was a member of a committee restoring the graveyard back in 1976, and he said that they were in dire financial straits. The congregation at Westminster Church had voted to dissolve, which caused the graveyard tours that Sam Porpora would lead to come to an end. In this article about the cemetery in 1973, the reporter said that on the day of Poe's birthday, 2 intoxicated men were lying against the base of the tomb, and a wine bottle was propped up with flowers on his grave. I know you might be thinking that this was the Poe toaster, but no, it was before nightfall, so this seems to just be a coincidence, probably placed there by one of the drunk guys laying there. The writer said that the graveyard was constantly vandalized and the bronze plaque of Poe's face was stolen, and wine bottles were strewn across the cemetery. The church and graveyard obviously needed money, so the scheme to get attention was concocted. Over the first few years, the ritual was tweaked slightly to make it more attention-grabbing. First cherry brandy, then Amontillado, then cognac with 3 red roses. It seemed to have worked. Over the years, the tradition became more and more famous and seems to have reinvigorated the public on the cemetery. Eventually, one man, probably somebody elderly based on the descriptions, was tasked with being the only Poe toaster, occasionally subbing out to someone younger when they weren't up to it. This would explain the occasional years in which a different-looking Poe toaster would show up. This continued until 1998, when they decided they had enough of staying up that late, or maybe they actually did pass away. I think that they actually did pass on the ritual to the younger relatives, and I am guessing that their relatives were not involved in what we would call the inner circle of people who invented the story back in 1997. This is why they did not really abide by the previously established code of conduct of the Poe toaster, leaving notes about sports and politics. I'm guessing that Jeff Jerome had much less creative control over the tradition after the baton was passed. I don't think that Jeff Jerome was savvy to the tradition ending after 2009, but I think that whoever assumed responsibility over the ritual really was not that interested in Edgar Allan Poe compared to their older relative, so they were happy to have a nice year to end it on, the bicentennial. As for Sam Porpora's claims, I think that he thought that they were true. By 2007, when he went public, he was 92 years old. He probably was not involved in the ritual since the 80s, so his memory would not have been so clear. He said that the initial interview he did mentioning the Poe toaster happened in 1967, when it really happened in 1976. I think this can be explained simply as an older man misremembering dates. As for the article in 1950, as I said before, I think that Jeff Jerome found it, and then showed it to the other people working at the cemetery. I can imagine that this is the kind of thing that, after 31 years, slips out of his mind and he remembers himself the recreator of the tradition. Just to be clear, this theory is mostly conjecture. I am only presenting it as an alternative to the standard story that I have proven is significantly artificial. Now I'm just going to go over a few points that probably mean nothing, but I came across them during my research, so I figured I want to put them here. A guy I mentioned earlier, Alexander Rose, was part of the Edgar Allan Poe Society, which is a non-profit that archives and catalogs Poe's life and work. What is interesting about him is that he is the only person to ever claim to have followed the Poe toaster longer than Jeff Jerome. He said that he's been following the ritual since the mid-1960s. The other interesting thing is that in his obituary, his colleague claimed that he knew the identity of the Poe toaster. It seems like it would be pretty weird for a colleague to lie about something like that in an obituary. There's been some speculation that Rose was the Poe toaster, but it doesn't really line up. He died in 1995, and the torch was passed in 1998. There was also this short period between 1994 and 96 when non-red roses were being left. In 94 and 95 they were white, and in 96 they were yellow. Probably also nothing. Back in 1956, a book was released detailing various stories about another famous Baltimore author, H.L. Mencken. It included an excerpt of him telling a story about how he used to go to Poe's grave and pour a bottle of whiskey on top of it, and then when liquor got too expensive, he suggested to piss on his grave. Although technically he was still alive back in 1950, when the first excerpt appeared, it is probably unlikely for him to be the Poe toaster given that he had a stroke 2 years earlier. There was a murder mystery book written about the Poe toaster by the author Laura Lippman, titled In a Strange City, which... yeah, I did read. It is surprisingly not that bad, maybe a 3 out of 5. Look, it was written back when he still had to capitalize internet and email, and website was 2 different words. It also mentions Jeff Jerome several times throughout its chapters, as well as being the first in the book's acknowledgements. The world was stinking with urban myths and internet-spawned apocrypha. Laura, I couldn't have said it better myself. After 2009 and the Poe toaster stopped visiting, the city of Baltimore cut the funding to the Poe House and Museum, where Jeff Jerome worked. Interestingly, PETA, that PETA, offered to fund the Poe House on the condition that they display a poster with the telltale heart of a meat eater, with the subtitle, "Don't be haunted by bad health, go vegan." The house was reopened in 2013 by the nonprofit Poe Baltimore, but Jeff Jerome no longer works there. What he does do is run an Edgar Allan Poe Facebook page with 122,000 followers, called Edgar Allan Poe Evermore. In 2015, the Maryland Historical Society held a competition to become the next Poe toaster, with artists submitting original performances based on the original. Okay, my first problem is, who are these guys to decide on an official Poe toaster? Whether this ritual was organic or actually made up by some guys working at a church, it definitely had nothing to do with the Maryland Historical Society. Also, the whole reason that people became fascinated by the original Poe toaster was the mystery of it. When you attach it to some old cultural institution with logos and chairmen, you lose all of the shadowy allure that created its original charm. On top of that, they held what was basically a talent show with celebrity judges and an audience vote to decide. And when they finally did choose a new one, the guy does it during the day, he plays a violin, there are even people inside the graveyard with him filming it. He doesn't even try to hide his face. Say you want about Jeff Jerome, but he knew how to cultivate a mystery. Nobody inside the graveyard, always at night, only one photo ever taken. That is why people cared about the Poe toaster, not because some guy dressed up and brought liquor and flowers to the grave every year. Just to wrap things up, I think that I should say that the amount of bad stuff that Jeff Jerome and the rest of the people who worked at the church probably did was pretty low. I don't really think that it is that bad to reinvent a harmless story to save a church that was in serious disarray. I do think that when Sam Porpora came up with his story, that would have been a pretty good time to open up about it. I understand why Jeff felt like he couldn't. He had staked so much of his reputation and image on the Poe toaster being an organic phenomenon that revealing it was artificial could have damaged his career. All that being said, I don't feel bad for digging up any of this information. So much of history is sourceless and unverifiable that I think it is right to correct the record before the story falls all the way into obscurity.